And our third speaker is my colleague at the CIS, Jeremy Sammut, who is a research fellow in the Social Foundations Programme and the author of the recently published report, The New Silence, Family Breakdown and Child Sexual Abuse.
Patrick and Bettina have examined the pertinent issues concerning family life and children and explained why this is an important social issue that we are reluctant to address. I'd like to add to their perspectives tonight on why we need to talk about this issue by explaining some of the background to the content and recommendations of my recent report, which you've seen the video for and which some of you have a copy in front of you. My report, The New Silence, Family Breakdown and Child Sexual Abuse, grew out of a previous report I wrote last year, which discussed the significance of the National Parliamentary Apology for the forced adoption of the babies of unwed mothers in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, that report continued the work that I've done and continue to do for the CIS on child protection in Australia. To cut a long story short, the point of that report was to say that we needed more adoptions in Australia to address the systemic problems in the child protection system. What we needed to do, and what we still need to do, is overcome the official taboo against adoption that exists because state and territory authorities are afraid of being accused of repeating discredited past practices associated with the history of forced adoption. Now, one of the arguments that I made in this report was to try and contrast the different circumstances surrounding the need for adoption today compared to 40 years ago. What I argued was that we had to face certain facts about how society has evolved over the last decades. Now, what we need to face is the reality that the problems that forced adoption was explicitly designed to prevent, which was the rise of a dependent class of struggling single mother families, has actually come to pass. In Australia, and we've seen some of these statistics before, but in Australia, single mother families are overrepresented in, on a population basis in cases of child abuse and neglect. About 18% of children live in single mother, sole parent families, mostly with single mothers, but these families account for around 30 to 35% of proven cases of child abuse and neglect each year. Now, this, along with other evidence concerning child welfare and family type, supports the traditional view of marriage being the best circumstances in which to raise children. Now, of course, adopting out the babies of teenage unwed mothers is, to our modern eyes, an incredibly harsh and unacceptable way to enforce the social norms that once surrounded marriage. And then to suggest, as I did in my report, that among Australia's burgeoning underclass of families, there are many single mother families in which children will be better off being adopted because of entrenched parental problems and ongoing child safety concerns, was a rather brutal way to buy into a controversial subject, which is the impact of family diversity on child welfare. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that all single mother families are terrible and that all their children should be adopted. Obviously, I agree with what Bettina said, that some single mothers and divorced families do a brilliant job of raising children. We know that in terms of child protection, the families with the most serious problems have a standard mix of problems: welfare dependence, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, mental illness. However, and as is what Patrick's slides were telling us, the research on family life and child welfare also shows that the harm to children associated with family breakdown occurs on a continuum, with marriage on average being the gold standard environment that is best for children. This may be a strange thing to say, but I've really been interested in this topic ever since I was a child. When I was growing up, I was always reluctant to tell people where my family originally came from because it was a place with a reputation. My mum and dad met, married and initially raised their family in Blacktown. We left in 1974 when I was 3. That was the first year, a year after the Whitlam government introduced the single mother's pension, which effectively ended the policy of forced adoption by making single motherhood financially viable with state support. And to the best of my knowledge, Blacktown in the 1950s and 60s was more or less like other suburbs. The community revolved around respectable social norms, principally based on work and marriage as the foundation of family life. To speak of Blacktown as a pillar of respectability sounds like a bit of a joke today, when the very name is synonymous with single motherhood and the related social problems. Chronicling Blacktown's social demise was, in a sense, part of my family's history, with the contrast between then and now sometimes featuring during dinner-time conversations. I also got to witness some of this firsthand because our old house in Blacktown was rented out. When my dad went to fix something or collect the rent, I would tag along, and on these occasions, when there was a single mother occupying the house, I would get a chance to see some of the squalor and chaos in which people lived. Now, this was all seen through the eyes of someone privileged enough to be growing up in Castle Hill, just 10 kilometres away as the crow flies, but a world away in terms of the social norms concerning the family. Whenever I see people mock the Hills District as the Bible Belt, I've always only had one response, which is, thank God, I'm glad that I was raised there, where divorce and cohabiting were rare, and single motherhood was virtually unknown, and not in Blacktown. Now, clearly, my own eyes and perceptions have shaped my views about the social changes that have basically spanned my lifetime. But when I went and examined the research evidence that would capture what has occurred since the early 70s, and which would help me put the need for adoption into a contemporary perspective, I found that it matched what the child protection data was telling me, which was that some families are better for children than others. Now, the rich literature on family type and outcomes for children, which is based on decades of research, has established that marriage on average, and I stress on average, is best for children. As both Patrick and Bettina have been saying, married families are able to provide more stable environments for raising children than divorced, cohabiting and sole parent families, and are able to bring greater economic resources and investments of time and other spiritual resources to the task of fostering the development of children. The neatest recent summary of this research is contained in Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. Murray writes, no matter what the outcome being examined, the quality of mother-infant relationship, behaviour in childhood, delinquency in adolescence, criminality as adults, illness and injury in childhood, early mortality, school problems and dropping out, and any other measure of how well or poorly children do in life, the family structure that produces the best outcomes for children on average are two biological parents who remain married. Divorced parents produce the next best outcomes. Never married women produce the worst outcomes. All these statements apply after controlling for the family's socio-economic status. Now, there was one aspect to this body of research that particularly grabbed my attention. This was the studies that show that children who don't live with both biological parents are sexually abused at much higher rates than their peers who do. Girls have been found to be especially vulnerable to abuse by non-biological dads, either a stepfather or boyfriend who is a new partner of their divorced or single mothers. The foundation study in this area found that girls who lived with non-biological dads were 6 to 7 times more likely to be abused by him than were girls living with natural fathers. Subsequent studies have confirmed this finding to the point that the elevated risk of sexual abuse in step and single mother families is a settled question in the academic literature. Given the academic interest in this subject, it is surprising that data on the family circumstances and perpetrators of child sexual abuse is not collected and published in Australia. The data in the US is better, not perfect, but much better. What the 2010 National Incidence Study of Abuse and Neglect found was that children who lived with both biological parents were sexually assaulted at significantly lower rates. Compared to children living in married two biological parent families, children who lived with a single parent with no cohabiting partner were 5 times more likely to experience sexual abuse. Children who lived with one biological and one non-biological step-parent were 8 to 9 times more likely to experience sexual abuse. And children who lived with single parents with a partner in the home were an astonishing 20 times more likely to experience sexual abuse. You would think that the link between family type and risk of sexual abuse is a very significant finding, deserving of much public attention, given the focus that has been placed on child sexual abuse since the problem was discovered, as the term is used, in the 1980s. In the late 1960s, around 1 in 10 Australian children did not live with both biological parents. Today, it's 1 in 4 children who live in step or sole parent households. We also know, and as Patrick has shown you, we have rising rates of mental illness in this country, particularly among young girls and women. We also know that children who experience sexual abuse are more likely to develop mental illness. If you talk to mental health professionals, teenage girls with a mental illness and a history of sexual abuse in broken families are a familiar scenario. The introduction of welfare for single mothers and the operation of the No Fault Divorce Act of 1975 as well as increasing rates of cohabitation, can rightly be referred to as a social revolution. What we have in fact been conducting since the early 1970s is a huge social experiment concerning the raising of children. However, society, or at least elite opinion makers in the media, politics and academia, the people in the ABC who Bettina was talking about, display little interest in discussing the results of this experiment, even if the relevant issue is the scourge of child sexual abuse, and that's why I titled my report The New Silence. I illustrate this disinterest in my report by noting the lack of reaction to an opinion article that Patrick wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald when his For Kids' Sake report was released, which a lot of those statistics have been drawn from. His piece mentioned the fact that children living in non-traditional families were more at risk of being sexually abused by men who were not their biological father. Now, when I read that, I thought, better him than me, because I thought he was going to be castigated. But to my surprise, and to the best of my knowledge, there was no real public backlash or disputing the evidence. There was just this silence. The messenger wasn't even shot, which is what sometimes happens. On this occasion, there was no response. The way to interpret this is that there was no discussion would be entertained, because even having the conversation was seen as possibly stigmatising certain families, or challenging the ideas that relationships are a private matter, or questioning whether family diversity is actually the positive social development it's portrayed as. And I thought this was a really good example of how these notions of what a tolerant and progressive society should and shouldn't talk about operate to close down, before it's even begun, what should be an important debate about family life and child welfare. I can't help but contrast this with the focus on child sexual abuse in institutions, particularly in the Catholic Church. I don't intend in any way to diminish the importance of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The Commission is doing crucial and overdue work investigating the mishandling and covering up of abuse by churches and other organisations. What I do question, however, is the way the Royal Commission gets pointed to as a symbol of how we've finally broken the silence surrounding child sexual abuse. In reality, I think there's a whole dimension to this problem that we are unwilling to discuss. What I think is happening is that we're only willing to talk about the issue to the extent to which the broader culture can bear. By this I mean we only talk about child sexual abuse to the extent the issue reinforces the progressive consensus, such as the notion that the countercultural idea that churches are all sources of traditional authority are corrupt and hypocritical. But we don't talk about child sexual abuse if the discussion challenges the consensus which the evidence actually shows is wrong, that family diversity is a positive thing and marriage, divorce and sole parenting don't matter. So in other words, we don't talk about marriage and the family. We don't have a frank and full public discussion of the issue because the subject runs against the progressive cultural tide of personal liberation, non-judgmentalism and freedom from traditional restraints on behaviour. And what we ultimately do here is put the interests of adults ahead of children. We give priority to the relationship and reproductive choices of adults and do not want to make adults feel bad about those choices, even if those choices can have adverse impacts on children. Now we know that family type affects outcomes for children in areas such as health, education and employment. Think about the amount of taxpayers' dollars spent on government programs designed to address inequalities and disadvantages in these areas, and yet we still don't discuss a fundamental source of these inequalities. So what can change this situation and why should we do something about it? What my paper discusses is that I think the situation in this country is different to that in the United States, and there's a ray of hope by looking at the US example. In the US, there's a much more informed debate about the cost to children and to government of family breakdown. For example, you can find a range of scholars and experts spanning the political spectrum of US think tanks and research institutes who speak openly and honestly about the links between single motherhood and intergenerational disadvantage and the benefits of marriage against the alternatives. What's happening is that secular organisations are making the case for marriage in the US, and the issue is gaining traction not as a religious or moral issue, but as a public policy issue, particularly in relation to efforts to reduce poverty. What the US experience suggests is that an informed debate about family and children can influence policymakers. As I show in the report, cities including New York and Chicago have started running public information campaigns warning of the risks to children associated with single motherhood. Informing the public about the benefits of getting and staying married and encouraging adults to make responsible relationship and reproductive decisions to give their children the best chance in life is something policymakers in Australia should ponder as well, and this is the key recommendation of my report. One question this raises is whether it is appropriate for government to promote marriage, or is this just another form of big government nannyism intruding into what are ostensibly personal matters and individual choice? My answer to that is that I think the family breakdown is a driver of bigger government, given the extent to which larger and larger amounts of government expenditure are perpetually devoted to addressing social inequalities, to say nothing of the direct cost of family breakdown in areas like welfare, child protection, and adult justice. I also think there's nothing inherently illiberal about expecting parents to fulfil their responsibilities to their children, particularly given the social costs associated with not fulfilling those responsibilities. To put it more bluntly, and to put a sharper end on it, if you think you can be economically dry, as in favour of smaller government, while being socially wet on the subject of the family, I think that's a mistaken formulation. I think this commonly expressed statement of political belief is fundamentally mistaking the relationship between the social revolution and the growth of the state over the last 40 years. In closing, and I'll just pick up on something that Bettina has already said, it's also worth pondering the point of Murray's book, Coming Apart. The title refers to the fact that in America, higher income groups are more likely to get married and to stay married and provide their children with all the advantages that marriage entails. Lower down the income distribution, Murray finds that the effects of family breakdown are being felt and is worsening inequality in America. What Murray has put his finger on, I think, is a kind of reverse hypocrisy. Elites may be saying politically correct things in public about family diversity and marriage not mattering, but are acting very differently, very traditionally in their private lives when the welfare of their own children is at stake. Ironically, it's in the underclass where we are most likely to see parents raise their children in a so-called progressive fashion, cut adrift from traditional values and floating in a sea of fatherlessness, multiple partners, drugs, dependence, and other depravities. The debate about the family is ultimately a matter of culture. Who and what should set the expected standards of behaviour for parents in relation to raising children? If the choice is between promoting the social norms that produce Castle Hill or the social norms that produce Blacktown, I think this tale of two suburbs makes it easy to support the promotion of marriage as a social good. Thank you.